Take back control. Stop letting algorithms decide your news. Get uncensored history and real knowledge to strengthen your mind, body, and spirit. Watch ad-free content now at ineverknewtv.com premium. There was an article you co-wrote called Parental Educational Attainment. The question I have is, a lot of times people always tell you read with your kids, do this with your children,
Yeah.
and they present it as if it's an absolute for outcome, right?
Hmm.
But in that article, you speak about how even though a parent has a certain educational level or
Hmm.
educational attainment, I believe that's the term you use, and they're working with the child, that socioeconomic status and that environment can trump the child's ability to learn
Yes. Yes.
and retain
Yeah.
information. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Mhm. Yeah, that's some of the work that I did with Shervin Asari, great public health scholar. You know, basically the argument is very straightforward that we tend to think that any kind of educational or academic underattainment on behalf of Black people, especially Black boys, is due to the lack of motivation, both from the student and from parental involvement. And what we found is that, well, look, when you start looking at racism, poverty, right, because poverty runs across the board in terms of all races and ethnicities, you see an effect on educational attainment and memory. And this becomes important because this is what I meant when I said that research is important because it tells us the differences that certain communities experience and challenges some of the universal assumptions we make. Universal assumptions that if you had a motivated child and a motivated parent, that child would succeed in school. But that presumes a few things. One, that the society is equal. Two, that the education system's equal. Three, that the educator, which is usually a white woman in America, of primary aged children in high school, is equal and unbiased, and that the child has no other effects out that could diminish the outcomes of a positive motivation and positive parental involvement. What we found is that, well, the environment matters, right? Stress matters, poverty matters, and racism matters. Not only in terms of the motivation the student has within a specific context, but in terms of how they develop their memory capacities and the way they perceive, retain information. Now, there have been other studies since the one that he was the first author that wrote that found similar things based on class. So, what it's really trying to show is that social, economic, and kind of historical environment, right, has an effect on both the development of children academically and intellectually, but also how they respond to different stressors, which may act against positive parental involvement and motivation. So, yeah, I think that it's I think we're still finding out just how far racism and the negation of Black people's humanity goes, right? It's that kind of research that's showing us that racism is not this just an idea of discrimination. And I think one of the worst things that happened out of the civil rights movement was this view that said racism was just like other forms of marginalization, because it's not, right? I mean, racism causes whole groups of people to disappear from the face of the earth. That's not the same thing as being feeling marginalized or not being recognized. It's eliminating the historical, physical, geographical presence of whole entities of people. And that's what racism does. It's funny because when you look at someone like even Martin Luther King in his last book, he's like, look, racism is dehumanization. It's this ability, it's this idea that people don't have the right to exist. When you read someone like Derek Bell, he says, look, racism in America is this idea that we didn't have the right or ability, that we should not exist. And you have this said over and over and over again, but that's never the definitions of racism that we seem to focus on. So when we find studies like the one that Asari and I co-author with others, you say, well, look, I don't understand this. Well, look, if you have an environment where everything negates you, if you have an environment where you're deprived of attention, of social interaction, of resources, of if you're malnourished, if you have lack of food access, right? Like all these things combine to produce a body politic, a population, a demographic that will suffer in relationship to the dominant group.